Hello and welcome everyone to today's book talk. I'm delighted to welcome my colleague and friend, Nicola Pratt, who will be in conversation with us. That is my colleague here at Brown, Professor Banu Özkazan-Span and myself. We will be discussing Professor Nicola Pratt's recent book, holding it here, Embodying Geopolitics, Generations of Women's Activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. My name is Nadia Ali, and I am currently director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. Before I continue, I just wanted to let you know that there is Arabic translation available, so you can go to the Arabic channel and you should be able to listen to a simultaneous translation. In terms of the talk today, it is part of a wider series that I've been trying to host here, and that is part of my attempt to focus on the centrality of gender and sexuality, trying to understand and analyze the Middle East and North Africa as well as its diasporas. And the book we are discussing today, in my mind, is really a perfect example of how a feminist lens, that is a gendered lens, is not only helping us to learn about women and men and masculinities for that matter, but can uncover wider political processes and dynamics. So when women took to the streets during the mass protests, which started over 10 years ago now, the subject of feminism in the Middle East and North Africa returned to the spotlight, the international spotlight. It was very much in the media. And in the subsequent years, countless commentators treated the region's gender inequality as a consequence of fundamentally cultural or religious problems. And this is very much at the heart of the book we're discussing today. It is actually, trying to challenge this culturalist perspective. So what Nicola does in her book, she turns to the relations of power in regional and in international politics to understand women's struggles for their rights. And as we will discuss further in our conversation, the book is based on over 100 extensive personal narratives from women of different generations in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And tracing, so Nicola in the book is tracing women's activism from national independence through to the Arab uprisings, arguing that activist women are geopolitical actors. Now, it is my pleasure at this point to introduce my colleague here at Brown, Professor Banu Özkazan-Span. We'll be sharing the discussion, we'll be in conversation with Nicola. Banu is professor of practice at the School of Engineering, and she is currently co-editor-in-chief of the journal Gender, Work and Organization, and the journal is co-hosting today's event. Over to you, Banu.
Thank you so much, Nadia. It's such a pleasure to be here and welcome everyone to this event with Nicola. So just a brief introduction about the journal. We are a multidisciplinary journal. We welcome particularly feminist work from across disciplines that are looking at any intersection of work and organization, including feminist mobilizations that are taking shape. We are currently ranked #1 in women's studies. So we are very excited about this and want to grow our community of feminist scholars and scholarship from across the globe, and would welcome your thought pieces and provocations and theoretical as well as empirical pieces. It's a pleasure to be able to host this event as part of the journal leadership team, because we believe that these kinds of engagements and writings really expand the repertoire of what we know as feminist work, particularly in regions where cultural scripts tend to dominate how we think about feminism. And it's really exciting to be here today to welcome Nicola. I wanted to introduce you to Professor Nicola Pratt, give you a little bit of background, and then we'll move on to her discussion. So Nicola Pratt is reader in the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick in the UK. She's also vice president of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. She teaches and researches on the international politics of the Middle East with a particular interest in feminist approaches as well as politics from below. She has written and co-edited a number of books on women and gender in the Middle East, and her most recent monograph, which we'll be discussing today, Embodying Geopolitics, Generations of Women's Activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, was published by the University of California Press in fall of 2020. She has written extensively on Egyptian politics from below and is currently co-authoring a book on popular culture and the contested meanings of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, which is the subject of a multimedia digital archive that she has co-curated, which can be found at egyptianrevolution2011.ac.uk. So thank you so much to Professor Nicola Pratt for being here with us and joining us, and we look forward to her talk and engaging our conversation today.
Great, thanks, Banu. Actually, I would like to add just a few personal words to this because I've known Nicola for a long time, I think over 25 years. I don't want to give away too much here, but so I've known Nicola since we're both graduate students in Cairo, and actually prior to being graduate students. And Nicola is not only my colleague and co-author. We have published quite a number of pieces together, and I should say that these were not just sort of academic pieces, but they were really important to me personally and politically, and I'm very grateful, for Nicola's support and companionship during really difficult times in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq and the occupation, when, the work we did together really, personally kept me sane, but it felt like, doing something constructive in a really difficult time. And I would also like to say that I've, over the years, have been really inspired by Nicola's courage and her commitment. I mean, not only in terms of the academic work, but she's been very active in the union movement in the UK and has also been an advocate for Palestine. And her recent, the current role as vice president of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, BRISMUS, I think, just the title conceals a lot in terms of, the hardship and the challenges. So I'm very excited to be in conversation with you, Nicola. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both, Nadia and Banu, for those really kind and generous words. Particularly Nadia, you're going to make me cry in a minute. That was very touching. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here today.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I'm going to start the conversation. Oh, I should say, so we will be in conversation for a while, but please feel free either through the webinar the Zoom function, or those of you who are following us on YouTube right now, please feel free to leave your comments or questions. We actually have someone who is monitoring the YouTube channel as well, because we won't see this and will be feeding us questions. And as a reminder, again, there is Arabic translation, so you can go to the interpretation button and choose Arabic if you prefer to listen to Arabic. Okay, so Nicola, I guess you have also been in many events. I mean, recently there have been so many events and conversations talking about the 10 years of uprisings in the region. And, we've been trying to challenge some of the underlying misconceptions of the narratives around the uprisings. I mean, often they're very ahistorical. And so, I think, we both agree that it's important to see wider continuities in terms of protest, dissent, and mobilization. And of course, one of these problematic narratives has focused specifically on women's political mobilization. And your book tries to challenge the idea that women started to get involved during the uprisings. I mean, start to get involved politically during the uprisings. And so I guess my first question is then, can you say more about the historical context that you're addressing in your book?
Sure, of course. So I wanted to demonstrate that there's a long history of women's mobilization and activism in the Middle East more broadly. Obviously, I'm just focusing in my book on Egypt, Jordan and Lebanon. And that history of activism goes back at least to the early 20th century, with especially under colonial rule, with the emergence of anti-colonial nationalist movements, and then coming up obviously to the present day. And it's important to document and show that long trajectory of women's activism as a sort of counter, sort of an antidote to Orientalist assumptions that still continue to be alive and kicking, particularly in Western media, that sort of assume that women are largely without agency and oppressed in the Middle East because of their culture, because of the culture and the religion. But I also, because I'm not the first academic by any means to document some of this history of women's activism, and Nadia, your work's been really important in this respect, in particular to the Egyptian women's movement. But I also wanted to sort of show that long continuity, sort of like not just focusing on one particular historical period, but that continuity from the colonial period until the present day, in order to sort of historicize women's activism. So in the book, it enables me to identify changes in women's activism over time, changes in the methods of activism or types of activism, the strategies that women pursue, the goals of their activism and the way they frame it. So identifying those changes over time, and importantly also the factors that have contributed to those changes. And in particular, I focus on the importance of geopolitical or political factors in that regard. And I think it's so important to understand this history, or to know this history, in order to understand contemporary women's activism, because so much of contemporary women's activism is informed by that history. There are both continuities but also ruptures. There are women's contemporary activism builds on that past, on that history of women's activism, but also to some extent, in some respects, disavows it. There's a sort of generational shifting that's really important to identify in order to understand the current moment. So yeah, that's basically what I try to do in the book.
Great, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this point about the generational shifts is so important and gets often ignored, but it's very important, or is often quite central in actually understanding shifting dynamics. Yeah. Vano, would you like to continue?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Nicola, for contextualizing sort of the historical ways in which activism has taken shape through women's activities, potentially differentiating over generations and time. So my thought is, in your book, you develop very cohesively this argument around women's activism as being viewed as a form of embodied geopolitics. Could you share with us what you mean by that term?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So for some people, actually, when I was sort of testing different possible titles for my book amongst friends on Facebook, quite a few people really didn't like the term geopolitics, because understandably it's very much associated with, dominant power, or, powerful Western nations sort of rationalizing their pursuit of global dominance or what have you. But I'm using the term building on a body of critical work within geopolitics. So critical geopolitics, feminist geopolitics, as well as feminist international relations and post-colonial international relations thinking. And therefore, this body of knowledge highlights the importance of gender in the rationalization and the exercise and the spatialization of power. So particular forms of gender relations, gender norms, modes of sort of femininities and masculinities are all important for geopolitical processes to occur, and such as state building, relations between states, the whole way in which we understand how the international state system works. These are all gendered concepts that rely on particular notions of gender. On the other hand, I'm also building on Judith Butler's idea of gender as performative. So seeing activism as embodied, seeing women's activism as an embodied activity means that I'm paying attention to the way in which activism is conducted by gendered bodies. So I think sometimes when when we talk about women's activism, we focus a lot on what are the stated goals of women's activism, but we don't pay attention so much to the actual process of activism as a form of embodied activity that occurs mainly in the public sphere. And because of that, because activism itself then is involved in the performativity of gender, but its effects are not just with relation to the construction of gender identity. Its effects go beyond that, because gender has such an importance for politics, for geopolitical processes. And also thinking about activism as embodied also means paying attention to the relationship between the body and the context in which that body is sort of interacting. So again, that's about looking at the specific geographical, cultural, historical context in which activism is occurring, in which that sort of shapes the meaning of activism in any particular moment. And in the book, I pay attention in particular to colonialism, anti-colonial struggle, the post-colonial state building moment, and how these different historical moments have been quite key to shaping the sort of constructions of gender, and how then women activists perform their gender through their activism, and then the effects that gender has in interaction with wider processes of anti-colonial struggle and state building, etc.
Thank you for that, Nicola. It sounds like one of the main premises here is rethinking the field of geopolitics, with starting with a gender analysis that's not peripheral, but central as an organizing principle for many of the processes, such that the movement in itself is not transactional, which is in many ways how it's talked about. There's an end goal, but really processual and iterative, contextualized in history. So thank you for sharing that. I know Nadia had some follow-up questions around some of the ways in which you saw the field work unfold across your contexts.
Yeah, thanks, Banu and Nicola. So, I mean, I know, like you, we've both been in Egypt and actually did some research together in Jordan, and I know you did research in Lebanon. And from my own work, I mean, I know that comparative research always prompts to ask the question, what are the similarities and what are the differences, both historically, but also in the current moment. So I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on that question, especially, maybe some of our audience might not be aware, what those similarities and differences might be.
Yeah. So I guess I should start by saying that I'm not, in my book, I don't pursue a sort of comparative method in the way that comparative political scientists do comparison. Rather, I was interested in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon for a number of reasons. First of all, because they're countries that I had already spent some time going to the field, and already had done research there, and had very important, contacts and networks of trust built up. And I think without those networks of trust, it would have been impossible to do this sort of research, which relies very heavily on, gaining access to women and them trusting you to tell them their personal history. However, I think what's interesting about Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon is they share a lot of similarities. First of all, that is that they all have, their respective regimes all have a commitment to modernist ideas of gender, and particularly some form of state feminism. So that's quite similar across all the three countries, although there's different maybe levels at which the state intervenes to pursue state feminist policies, with, I would say, Egypt being perhaps the most state feminist, and Lebanon the least, because just of Lebanon's sort of history is sort of a relatively non-interventionist type of state. They also share similarities because of their actual geographical location. So all three countries are what we call in the field of the Arab-Israeli conflict frontline states. All three countries have been involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict at some point. And this means that they've shared a lot of similar important historical moments that are related to that, but also they've shared, they're very similar times of decolonization, of gaining national independence, and similarly they all, like all of the countries in the region, they've gone through the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. The fact US is hegemonic in the region has impacted all three of them. The differences, though, are also important to look at, and these are mainly due to they have different histories of state formation. So Egypt was already a pretty cohesive territorial entity under the Ottoman Empire, and whereas Jordan and Lebanon were not. They were part of the provinces of Greater Syria, and therefore their state building, the identity, the national identity construction within those countries came at a later point. And I think, especially for Jordan and Lebanon, where not only have you got a recent sort of a very recent history of nation state identity building, but also you've got very could say, without sounding too deterministic or orientalist, you've got sort of a multi-religious or fragmented, socially fragmented types of population, and this has impacts on how regimes have been able to consolidate their power. And I think women's rights have been really important in different ways then to that process. So in Lebanon, the sort of multi-confessional political system is very much, the sort of anchor of that is very much the sectarian personal status laws, and those and as a result of that, that's made it very difficult for women's activists to challenge and to transform personal status laws, because they are so integral to regime consolidation in Lebanon. Similarly, in Jordan, where the monarchy has relied on the support of the tribes, that has also created an impetus for sort of conservative gender bargains, which again has made it more difficult for women to challenge, to transform personal status laws. So in comparison, Egypt, there's been perhaps more opportunity although that's not to say that somehow Egypt is the model to which other countries should aspire in terms of its personal status laws, but there is this sort of relative, that you can see these sorts of relative differences between the three countries that I argue are linked to those histories of state formation and challenges of regime consolidation in all three.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's I found, one of the most interesting aspects of your book, the kind of balancing on the one hand, creating this more, general narrative about the dialectic between, the gendered politics of feminist mobilization and the wider geopolitics and how they play into each other. And of course, big sort of narratives and developments here are clearly, anti-colonial struggle. I mean, colonialism originally, but then the independence struggles and the post-colonial state formation, but also very much key, the Arab-Israeli conflict and how this has developed. But you also refer, of course, to Islamization and the rise of Islamist movements. And yeah, but then, at the same time, when I also think about the three countries, as you say, the demographics are quite different, and the contestations around identity and gender and class, in the context in Egypt, you have the kind of Muslim Copt tensions, which are very different from, Lebanon, where you have a whole range of different sectarian denominations, and of course, a long history of overt sectarian conflict and war. And then Jordan, what comes to mind in Jordan is, of course, the very large percentage of Jordanians, Palestinian population, and the waves of refugees. And I guess displacement and refugees, forced migration is sort of another, element that has played out very differently in the countries. Thanks. So before I'm going to ask Banu to continue, I'd just like to encourage again our audience to put in their questions in the Q&A here on the webinar, or if you're on YouTube, you can also put your questions and someone is monitoring those. Okay, Banu, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. So I wanted to shift a little bit here in terms of coming out of the text and looking at how you put the text together. So in, conducting the actual fieldwork, the research, what were some of the highlights? And at the same time, what were some of the challenges you faced, ethical or otherwise, in putting together this vast amount of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously a big highlight was to be able to meet so many women and hear their stories, and it felt like a real pleasure and honor, to have that opportunity. The challenges, though, were also quite important, because I did this fieldwork in quite a concentrated amount of time. So I spent 4 to 5 weeks in each country, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, in the space of 8 months. So I made 3 fieldwork visits in the space of 8 months. And in each of those visits, overall, I collected over 100 interviews. So that's quite exhausting for, at the time, I was sort of in my early to mid 40s. I couldn't imagine if I'd have the stamina to do that. Now I'm in my just turned 50. So I think there's definitely an issue around how much energy you need to do that sort of intensity of field work. The other major challenge was the sort of unstable political and authoritarian context. So I did this research between 2013 and 2014, and this was coming after several years of conflict in Syria, which was causing political tensions in Lebanon, and also it was coming in the wake of the 2013 military coup in Egypt and the massive repression of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I mean, things that I can't, I mean, I don't think I'd be able to do this research at all now in Egypt, but even at that point in Egypt, things were, you know, it was clear the sort of direction of travel that the new regime was going in. So already there was a huge difficulty for me to be able to speak to any woman from the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. Although I managed it, but it was really, really difficult, and it was by no means very extensive. In Lebanon, people were worried about the political situation, what was happening. It was on their minds. So for a lot of people, it wasn't really a priority for them to meet with me and spend time speaking to me. Now things, perhaps now, looking back, that period seems relatively stable for Lebanon. But so it's interesting as well how at the time, though, very much the perceptions were that this was a really difficult and very politically tense period. So yeah, all of that obviously makes it much more difficult to try and get people to speak to you. I should also say that though the greatest challenges for me were actually in writing the book afterwards, because I had so much data, to use that awful social science term. I had like hours and hours of interviews, and at first I was just a bit of a loss of what to do with all of this and how to, I had an idea I was going to approach this chronologically. So, each chapter of the book would deal with a different historical moment. But once I started writing up the interviews, it was a real challenge at first for me to think, how can I do this in an interesting way without just sort of being very descriptive. And so it actually took me quite a while to finish writing the book. So right from 2014 until 2019.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's always amazing to think about how we whittle down the amazing amounts of data, information, and personal narratives, I think are particularly challenging. So thank you for sharing that. I always think about what would the next iteration of such a book look like, going forward. Where will we be in 10 years? So thank you for sharing the processes through which and the challenges you faced in putting this together for your audience. So it's such a pleasure to be able to read it. So I'll pass it on to Nadia. I know she had some questions around knowledge.
Yeah, well, actually, you mentioned data, and I know that we've had, so many conversations, and I mean, we're of course also now actually trying to write a book together. And one of the things that we're trying to do in that context, but I know you were also trying to do previously in your work, is to not treat people in the region as data, right? Sort of this is, of course, has been the history of knowledge production about the Middle East. This kind of even some of the kind of post-Orientalist scholarship, very much looking at people, including women activists, as objects of our knowledge production, but not as subjects. And so I know that you have been very much interested also in this attempt to decenter, what is kind of, I mean, it's not homogenic, of course, Western academic knowledge production, but this idea, okay, so there is data and we are producing knowledge in Western institutions. So I'm wondering, how did you actually try to address that dilemma in the book? And how are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about it as an ethical question, as an epistemological question? What were your guiding principles?
Yeah, so certainly I didn't want people to feel like I was using them to test out my own hypotheses or something like that. I wanted people to feel like I was interested in what they had to say for what they wanted to say, see what I mean? Like, not for my own purposes, but it was an inductive research process. I was interested to hear people's stories as forms of knowledge production in their own right. So I'm very much guided by feminist research, ethics and epistemology. I mean, and I think the two, ethical and the epistemological, are very much interrelated for feminists. Yeah, so this was really important for me to, for me, my interviewees are themselves producers of knowledge. It's situated and embodied knowledge about the politics of the Middle East, and the use of personal narratives was a really important method for me in this respect, because I think personal narratives are an excellent method for revealing those sorts of for that sort of embodied and situated knowledge. And I think also it was important not to treat, so I mean, there's different ways of dealing with personal narratives and the sort of like different traditions within all history. Certainly I didn't want to treat personal narratives as objective historical sources, which I was sort of excavating for information about events that occurred and that sort of thing. Although that's not to say that there's no place for that sort of approach, but I was mainly treating personal narratives as revealing of subjective meanings. These are about the meanings that activist women themselves bring to their activism, their motivations, the meaning of past events for them. It's about revealing, and here I'm very influenced by Luisa Passerini's work, it's the relationship between the self and memory, between the self and the collective, the self and the wider socio-political context in which women activists are doing their work and activities. So yeah, for me, the method of personal narrative was very important in this respect.
Yeah, that was quite obvious in the book, and but it's always tricky, isn't it? I mean, I've struggled as well with this relationship between experience, memory and history, and the question in how far got what we choose to remember and what we also choose to narrate, how that is not only linked to the past but very much linked to the present and an aspiration to the future. So that tension. Yeah, okay, well, I see we have questions coming in. Banu, you want to maybe ask one more question and then we move to the audience questions?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that, Nicola. I always think about sort of the triad of, ethics, epistemology, and activism, and the power that we have to narrate or forget or to remember. So thank you for making that so clear in your book. As we think about sort of how you end the book, you say something along the lines of gendered geopolitics of fear and counter-revolution. Can you sort of expand a little bit more on that? What does the gendered politics of fear look like? How do they manifest themselves? And are there strategies to counter them that you saw in your work?
Yeah. So that final chapter is very much illustrative of the problems of modernist notions of gender. That is, like, seeing gender or women's rights as always something progressive, and in fact it's not only in that chapter, but I think particularly in that chapter it's very much highlighted how women's rights and gender issues can become and not just can but often are implicated in authoritarian projects, in securitized and exclusionary and repressive projects as well. it's, I guess, a bit of a pessimistic note, in the wake of the Arab uprisings. But I thought it was something that very much came out of my interviews, that by gendered politics of fear, I mean the way in which women's fears about their personal rights and freedoms, about their security and the security of their families or friends, how those fears became mobilized and deployed within these sort of narratives of counter-revolution and securitization and repression, specifically because of the way that these gender issues were constructed in ways that reproduced a racialized other that was a threat. And in the case of Egypt, that was the Muslim Brotherhood. In the case of Lebanon and Jordan, it was Syrian refugees. So these racialized others were constructed as the threat to these women's lives, to their personal safety. And as a result, that served to then somehow normalize or justify the violence and repression that has been enacted against these groups. But it's also very important to point out that sort of fear is something, I'm building on other authors here, that fear is not something that's sort of natural. It is socially constructed, and it's very much linked to, it's constructed in relation to people's everyday experiences, and particularly fear can emerge out of contexts of inequality and marginalization. So these women saw themselves as the victims, and that enabled them to justify why others should be the target of repression or containment. I mean, I think in Jordan and Lebanon, it's not that women activists were sort of calling for Syrian refugees to be, they weren't calling for any sort of violence against Syrian refugees, but they were seeing Syrian refugees as a threat that needed to be contained and policed. That Syrian refugees are potentially, especially men, a source of violence and instability. So definitely for me, this was it was difficult to hear these things. So I do want to sort of try and situate them and to understand why they emerged. As I say, they were they're socially constructed fears. And I think I think the question of how do we what strategies for overcoming these gendered fears that can give rise to counter-revolution and political repression. I think, first of all, it's important as feminists to be aware of the wider geopolitical context in which discourses of women's rights and gender issues are circulating, and that women's rights cannot be decoupled, cannot be sort of seen in isolation of wider geopolitical contexts. So it's really important then to avoid depoliticized models of women's rights or other types of important gender issues. That I think that's a really important strategy. The other perhaps slightly more theoretical strategy is to critique modernist notions of gender, which is quite difficult to do, though, because in practice, what my interviews demonstrated and observations shows that actually women quite often leverage these modernist notions of gender to justify progress in women's rights. Progress in women's rights is held up as a sort of marker of national progress. So that that coupling of gender with national modernity has often worked in favour of women's rights. But of course, then the problem is that, as I said, you can't decouple that from a wider geopolitical context where potentially women's rights may be being used in ways that justify repression or domination. So I think it's a longer term project to sort of critique and think what would alternative notions of gender look like if we abandon modernist notions of gender. What's the alternative? I'm not sure I've got that answer at the moment.
Banu, shall I read out some questions? I think I moved to that.
Absolutely.
Yes, we have quite a number of questions. So if it's okay with you, Nicola, I'm going to read out a few questions.
Okay.
Because in the interest of time, and I'm just skimming through them. Okay, so I'm reading out a question from Etimat Matar. Can you please give examples of the shifting dynamics of women's activism throughout the history of the studied countries? So that's the first question. Then we have a question by Hamida Zaberi. The question I have is a little beyond the subject. As an Iranian feminist, I would like to know your perspective about the strong relationship between Arab feminists and Iranian feminists. Don't you think it can be a very strong movement against the religious patriarchal system? And how do you realize the current relationship between Middle Eastern feminists? And then I will read out a third question before handing over to you, Nicola. And that question is by Kevin de Jesus. What themes arose in women's articulations of their own constructions of themselves as geopolitical actors? And did you find these perspectives vary by country? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have a number of others. So if you could address those, and then hopefully we get to another round of questions.
Okay, those are all really great questions. All right, I'll take them in order. So some examples of how women's activism has shifted over time. I think I would say that there's never one type of women's activism at any particular moment. There's always some diversity of women's activism. However, I think that in different periods of time, we can see certain forms of activism being more dominant than others, and also in certain periods are very much associated also with the emergence of new types of activism. So I guess what I would say is like anti-colonial struggle, this is where women very much, that their contribution to that anti-colonial struggle was very much in the field of welfare, social services. So you have women's associations emerging, and they saw themselves as playing an important role in terms of the uplift of the nation. And these were very much upper middle class women's associations. In the post-colonial period, you have a continuation of that sort of activism, but then you have the emergence also of more politicized, although of course all women's activism is political, but I should say more, let's say women's activism associated much more with new ideological movements. So after 1948 and in the early years of state building, with the spread of pan-Arab nationalism and its popularity across the Arab world, you have this increasing association of women, or women re-signifying some of their sort of welfare and social services in line with these new ideological movements. After 1967, you get the emergence of, so also these are very much associated, I should say, with different generations of women as well, of radical new political and social movements, associated very much with the Palestinian national movement. And you've got women for the first time becoming perhaps, in large numbers associated with political parties, political groups, and political movements. In the post-Cold War period, I'd say NGOization is the sort of hegemonic model of women's activism. And that's sort of continuing until today. The Arab uprisings did see a new moment of more grassroots, informal type of women's organizing, and to some degree that's continuing, not so much in Egypt because of the political repression, but I hope that gives a flavor of some of the different ways in which women's activism has changed over time, and in relation to and how those changes are very much linked to changing geopolitical dynamics. With regards to Arab and Iranian feminists, of course, it would make huge sense for there to be alliances and networks and solidarity between Arab and Iranian feminists, just as there would be more widely between feminists in the Middle East and other parts of the globe. I think, you know, unfortunately there's very clear geopolitical dynamics and tensions that make those sorts of networks and alliances very difficult and potentially dangerous for both Arab and Iranian feminists. So I think it's a question of how you see how the wider geopolitical context can really impact on the opportunities and the challenges for women's activism, and yes, without maybe a resolution of those tensions between Iran and other Arab countries, then I think it would make it very difficult for women activists to build those sorts of alliances, unless, of course, maybe in the diaspora there might be more openings for that. And certainly there's a lot of common ground that I'm sure that Arab and Iranian feminists could find. The women, how did women, if I've correctly written down the question, how did women articulate their own personal constructions of themselves as geopolitical actors? So I would say that no woman used the term geopolitical in conversation with me. In fact, a lot of women don't like to think of their activism as political at all, because you know, there's, let's say, dominant gender norms construct politics as something that's not proper for women, except, you know, in sort of exceptional circumstances, women have been managing to break that barrier, but a lot of women are not revolutionary or radical activists. They're, you know, that they don't see themselves in that way, and therefore they frame their activism in ways that seems unthreatening and respectable, such as, for example, helping people, you know, providing services, doing voluntary work, helping women to know about their rights, that sort of thing. So even much more sort of political ideological women would not necessarily use the term, use the term as seeing themselves as a geopolitical actor. Rather, it's the way in which they relate to, for example, state building, state feminism. They're situating themselves very much within the particular geopolitical context in which they find themselves. And I try to convey some examples of that in the opening quotes in my book. So I start the introduction citing, you know, with short quotes from a number of different women that I interviewed. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, it's a sample, but I try to show how women very much situate themselves and understand their activism in relation to the context in which they find themselves. And that context is both an interpersonal context, one of being within a particular family, those sorts of family and intimate relations. It's also a wider national context of being a citizen of a particular country or a resident of a particular locale. So place, location, geopolitical context very much is implied in the ways in which women talk about their activism. So that's what motivated me to make that a central theoretical analytic for the book.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll go 5 minutes over if that is okay for everyone. But before I ask Banu if she could kindly maybe read out another 3 questions, I just wanted to briefly interject on the question of, you know, Iranian feminism and Arab feminism. And I mean, I agree with everything that you said. I guess I would like to add that I think what often gets lost in these discussions is that, of course, it's Arab majority and it's kind of Persian majority. But, you know, when I think, for instance, I mean, of Kurdish women's feminist activism, that of course cuts across Arab and countries and Iran. And we know that, you know, Kurdish feminists work across nation states. Yeah, but Banu, would you
point? Thanks for interjecting.
Banu, would you like to maybe read out 3 questions? And yeah, we'll go a few minutes over if that is okay.
Yeah, there's some good ones. So I'm going to try to summarize them from Christina. And some of this has been answered, but a little bit more in depth here. Very much. Thank you very much for an insightful talk. I have 2 questions. First one's about democratization in the Middle East. Would you say women as part of civil society are or might be a crucial driver of the potential democratic transition of the countries in the Middle East? And secondly, is the female movement in the region united? Are there any active links between the female groups in different MENA states or with women in exile across the world? I think you started to answer some of this, Nicola. Another question is from Amal. Thank you very much, Nicola, for your very interesting insights. I was wondering if there were any sort of repetitive patterns within and or across the 3 different countries over the different historical eras. For example, repetitive state interventions over time in response to women's activism. And then lastly, from Rania, how did the women you interviewed define women's rights or women's issues in their activism in the 3 states? I'm particularly interested in the women's views after the turn of the millennium.
Okay. So, women's roles in democratization, I would say again, I don't think you can sort of homogenize women in this respect. Definitely, there are lots of examples in my book of how women have been very much part of movements for greater democracy, both, you know, in the past and obviously continuing until today. And also, what's very important since 2011 is also the way in which women have insisted that women's rights and gender issues are part of that agenda for democratization as well. But, you know, there are also women who have, you know, for whom they're quite happy. Let's say they manage to accommodate themselves to authoritarian contexts as well, and they find ways to pursue their activism within authoritarian contexts and don't necessarily want to rock the boat by being confrontational. I mean, obviously, calling for democracy in an authoritarian context will necessarily bring you into confrontation with authorities. So again, it really depends on the woman activist herself. And I think, without sounding too simplistic, we could say there's 2 types of, let's say there's 2 sort of archetypes: women who work within the system as it is, and as I say, find ways to manage and leverage themselves within the current system, and women who try to change the system. However, I would say that's also very simplistic, because one of the things I stress in my book is that women can be part of challenging dominant power relations at certain geographical scales, whereas they are accommodating them or sort of working with power within power relations at other scales. So women might challenge gender relations at the interpersonal level through their activism, but at the sort of national level, they are not pursuing that sort of confrontational strategy. So I also think it's important to think about the effects of women's activism at different scales, from the personal to the international. Whether women are all united, certainly not. So I've just given you two archetypes of women. However, sometimes those women will cooperate. But I would also bring into the mix, again, without being too essentialistic, the differences that exist between secular-oriented women activists and Islamist women activists, and those differences are quite wide, and in general, those two groups of women activists do not cooperate or work together, and in fact see themselves as being almost enemies of one another in terms of their respective agendas. And I go into more depth in the book about sort of Islamist women, how they view their agenda versus secular women activists. However, I must say it's what's really surprising is how women, both secular women and Islamist women, often have very similar understandings of women's rights on many issues. The main difference is around CEDAW. That seems to be the major issue, is whether CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, should be a major frame of reference for women's rights in the region. But for example, I found very similar projects pursued by both Islamist women activists and secular women activists, such as the empowerment of women, leadership training, improving women's rights in terms of inheritance, increasing political awareness, a lot of very similar projects, because as Leila Abu-Lughod has written about, actually both Islamist and secularists share these modernist notions of gender. In terms of repetitive themes across time and across countries, I think that if there's any repetitive theme, it's the theme of how important gender was and continues to be in terms of state building and regime consolidation, and therefore the ways in which regimes try to either control, co-opt, or suppress certain types of women's activism. They might allow they'll allow the types of women's activism that's in line with their modernizing agendas, but will not be so keen to allow types of women's activism that in any way can be seen as a challenge to either regime leadership or would be seen as undermining regime authority. So yeah, there's probably some others. I think my brain's beginning to seize up a bit.
We're running out of time as well, so don't worry. Maybe you want to answer the last question.
Yeah, how to define women's rights. So I'd say in the post-Cold War period, and I've mentioned it already, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, has become the hegemonic reference for women's rights amongst secular-oriented women activists. That was somewhat challenged in the Arab uprisings, because there did emerge new initiatives to if you like, indigenize or to create a local language of women's rights and gender that very much was linked to the desire of women activists to reach out and you know, to reach different communities, you know, to get beyond the sort of elitist women's NGO scene and reach the grassroots. And again, some of those initiatives continue. It's very difficult, though, to be in Egypt, to be reaching out to anybody because of the levels of repression. But I think in Lebanon and maybe in Jordan, these sorts of initiatives are still continuing. So that it's a new trend to sort of keep an eye on, to see where that goes. I think I've run out of steam.
Well, no, thanks so much. I mean, we've also run out of time, and yeah, I'd like to thank you, Nicola, for extremely interesting conversation. Of course, we could go on, and I you know, encourage you all to actually read Nicola's book. It's definitely worth it. And thank you as well, Banu. I'll hand over to you to say the final words, and of course, many thanks to our audience as well for listening in and also for asking questions. We will have a recording of the event available in a week or so, and we will then be able to circulate this. So thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, and a real gratitude, Nicola, to you for sharing all your experiences and expertise and really kindly answering all our questions, which I know is exhausting, but I think for myself have learned tremendous amount. And I have also purchased and read the book, so I would encourage our audience members to do the same. And thank you again. So thank you to everyone on behalf of myself and the journal for being here. And I look forward to seeing everyone on our next event at CMIES.
I say thank you as well to the audience for coming and for your great questions, and to Nadia and Banu for your wonderful questions, and for Barbara for organisation, everybody who's behind the scenes. This has been really, I've found this to be a really great experience, and I've really enjoyed it. So thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye, thank you.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.